Hey, my friend, welcome back to another episode of the Soul Podcasting Podcast. I'm Demetria, your host, and I have been enjoying being a podcast coach for over 20 years. Started my first show in 2005, and I'm really glad you're here. Whether this is your first time listening or you've been with me for a while, thank you for choosing to spend this time thinking intentionally about your podcast. I don't take it lightly. So today we're tackling a topic that sounds simple on the surface, but quietly determines how far your podcast can actually go. We're going to talk about how to name a podcast. I recently worked with a client who'd been sitting on a full recorded first season for 8 months. The episodes were done. The cover art was ready. She just couldn't bring herself to publish because she wasn't confident in the name. And every time she tried to move forward, she'd second guess it. She'd start over again and end up back where she started. That paralysis cost her momentum, confidence, and 8 months of potential impact. The name had become the obstacle instead of the gateway. This episode exists because I see a lot of podcasters stuck at the very beginning, not because they don't have something to say and not because they're not qualified, but really because they're frozen trying to come up with the perfect name. And on the other end of the spectrum, I see podcasters who rushed the naming process and now they feel boxed in, misunderstood, or invisible. Naming a podcast isn't just a creative exercise. It's a strategic decision. And when it's done well, it supports your message, your audience, and your long-term goals. But when it's done poorly, it creates friction everywhere, from the discoverability of your show to confidence and even to growth. So today, I want to walk you through how to name a podcast in a way that's clear, thoughtful, and sustainable. Not trendy, not clever for the sake of clever, but useful. And before we get into the how, we need to talk about why naming a podcast is harder than people expect. Most people assume the name is just a label, something you slap on so you can move on to the next real work of recording. But a podcast name does a lot of work behind the scenes. It sets expectations. It signals who the show is for, and it influences whether someone clicks or scrolls past. It affects how your podcast shows up in search, and it shapes how you talk about your own show. So when someone asks you what your podcast is called, your answer should make sense without a long explanation. If you have to immediately follow the name with, well, it's kind of about, that's a sign the name isn't pulling its weight. A podcast name isn't a slogan and it's not a mission statement. It's not even a personality test. It's closer to a headline. Its job is to really orient the listener quickly and accurately. I've named multiple podcasts over the years, and I've watched how different names perform in real life and not just in theory. So one of the clearest examples is my homeschool podcast that I ran for 14 years. It was called Christian Homeschool Moms. That name is not clever, although it kind of is. It's not really abstract either. It doesn't require explanation, and that's exactly why it works. The listener knows immediately who the show is for and what it's about. For Christian homeschool moms. There's no confusion. And because the audience is clear, everything else becomes easier. The content is focused. The marketing is focused. And even the publishing schedule aligns with the audience's life. That show performs best when episodes are released on weekday mornings because that's when homeschool moms are actually available to listen during breakfast, cleanup, or at the start of the school day. And so I kind of knew that my audience wanted episode releases in the morning. And I named that podcast back in 2012. Even then, I was thinking about search engine optimization. I knew that homeschool moms were searching for content using those exact words, Christian and then homeschool and then moms, not clever variations and not creative plays on words. They actually use those terms and type them into search bars. So that strategic decision has compounded over the last 12 to 14 years. And the show ranks consistently because the name matches the search intent. New listeners find it easily. And when someone recommends it, there's no confusion about what to search for. The clarity in the name created clarity in everything else. The content strategy, the community it built, and just the longevity of the show itself. That name supports the listener's reality. Now, we can contrast that with this particular podcast I'm running called Soul Podcasting. This name is more conceptual. It's values driven. It reflects how I think about podcasting, not just as content, but as expression, leadership, and legacy. And when I was naming this podcast, I knew the word podcasting had to be in the title. That was non-negotiable for both searchability and just for immediate context. But the word soul, I felt, was deeply intentional because it came directly from the work that I wanted to do here, which is teaching podcasters how to create with intention and not just with tactics. So podcasting with soul means you're not just following trends or chasing downloads. You're really anchoring your show in something deeper, like your values, your voice, and your vision. That word carries weight for me. So it signals a particular kind of approach. And yes, it does require the subtitle and some positioning to clarify, but that's the trade-off that I was willing to make. The name reflects kind of the ethos of the work, and that matters to me and to the listeners who resonate with that language. But the key difference here is that it doesn't stand alone. The subtitle, the description, the positioning, they do the clarifying work. This show isn't trying to reach everybody. It's for creators who already resonate with that kind of language and are willing to lean into it. Different goals require different naming strategies. And one of the most common mistakes I see podcasters make is choosing a name that's too vague. Vague names feel safe because they don't commit too hard. They leave room. But what they really do is they leave the listener guessing. So if your name could describe 10 different podcasts, it's not doing enough work. Another common mistake is prioritizing cleverness over clarity. Clever names feel fun in the moment, they feel creative, but if the listener has to think too hard to understand what your show is about, they're not going to stick around to figure it out. Podcast apps are scroll environments. You have seconds, not even minutes, to communicate the relevance of your show. There's also the mistake of naming the podcast for yourself instead of the listener. This happens a lot with personal brand podcasts. The name reflects how the host sees themselves and not how the listener experiences the content. A good podcast name answers the listener's unspoken question, is this for me? That brings us to the balance between clarity and creativity. This is where a lot of podcasters get stuck emotionally. They worry that a clear name will just sound boring, that it won't feel unique enough. But clarity doesn't mean bland, it just means precise. One of the most underused tools in podcast naming is the subtitle. A strong subtitle allows you to pair a creative or values-driven title with a clear explanation. So your main title can communicate your vibe or your brand, but your subtitle can communicate function, and together they do far more than either could by themselves. So let me give a couple of examples. A podcast called The Daily pairs that simple, memorable title with the subtitle, "This is what the news should sound like." The title is clean and easy to remember. The subtitle clarifies the format and the approach. Or consider How I Built This with the subtitle, Guy Raz dives into the stories behind some of the world's best known companies. The main title sparks a curiosity. The subtitle tells you exactly what you're getting and who's hosting. So this structure works really well because it respects both creativity and clarity, and you're not forced to choose one or the other. When I work with clients on naming, I'm not looking for perfection. I'm looking for alignment between the listener, the content, and the long-term vision for the show. So to name a podcast strategically, you need to answer a few questions honestly. Who is this for? And of course, it's not for everyone. Who specifically? What problem does the podcast help them think through or solve or live with more clarity? What tone does the show carry? And is it educational or conversational or reflective, authoritative? And just as importantly, where do you want this podcast to take you? Naming a podcast for a short-term idea when you want long-term growth is a recipe for frustration. And at the same time, naming a podcast so broadly that it says nothing is just as limiting. Search and discoverability matter too, but not in the way most people think. You don't need to cram keywords into your title. In fact, that often works against you. But what matters more is relevance. Podcast platforms look at titles and subtitles and descriptions all together, not just one or the other. YouTube changes the conversation even more because titles can be episode specific while the channel name stays consistent. So here's how this plays out practically. Now, let's say on Apple Podcasts, your title and subtitle appear together in search results and on your show page. Now, if someone searches, let's take a parenting podcast for an example. If someone searches parenting teens and a podcast titled Raising Resilient Teens, a guide for parents navigating adolescence, is more likely to surface than something called The Messy Middle, right? On Spotify, the algorithm considers your show title, description, and even episode titles when recommending content. And then on YouTube, you have even more flexibility because your channel name might be your podcast title, but then each video title can be optimized for search independently. So a YouTube podcast about productivity could be named The Focused Life, while individual episode titles target specific searches like how to plan your week effectively or time management for entrepreneurs and that kind of thing. So the platform you prioritize should influence how you think about naming your show. If you're publishing on YouTube, you want a podcast name that can grow with you visually and conceptually. If you're audio only, clarity still matters, but you have more flexibility in your tone. And another thing to consider is whether the name works out loud. Like, can you say it naturally in conversation? Like, can someone actually remember it after hearing it just once? Can they spell it if they want to look it up? Those are practical questions, but they do matter. And now we're going to talk a little bit about renaming because I know that's an issue, and I have renamed my podcast before, and you might be thinking of doing the same if your name currently doesn't align with where you're going with your podcast in the future. So many of you listening already have a podcast. Just know that renaming is not failure. It's just a sign of growth. It should be done intentionally, though. A rename makes sense when the current name no longer reflects the content. The audience has shifted significantly, or the show has evolved beyond its original scope. One of the things that I'm personally thinking of doing is renaming my show. Not this one, but a podcast that I put on pause that I ran for 14 years, the Homeschool one that I was telling you guys about. And if I do pick up that podcast again in the future, I will very likely rename it. But I have to do so with intention, and probably will be having some conversations with my own personal business coach to see where I want to go with that. What doesn't make sense is renaming out of boredom or out of insecurity. A new name isn't going to fix inconsistent publishing or unclear content. It's not going to fix your strategy. The name should support the work and not replace it. So if you do rename your podcast, it's important to communicate that change clearly. Let your audience know why, update all your supporting materials, and treat it as a repositioning, not a quiet swap. I love how Amy Porterfield renamed her podcast and the process that she did along the way. A lot of well-known podcasters have done this, and they've really made the process look pretty simple. And so it's not difficult to do. It's just something that you need to think through strategically. And I do want to come back to something important before we wrap up. A good podcast name does not carry your podcast. Your thinking does, your consistency does, but the name just opens the door. So you don't need the perfect name to start, but you do need a name that's honest and clear, and one that is definitely usable, and one that you can stand behind, one that serves the listener, a name that gives you room to grow without constantly explaining yourself. If this episode helped you think differently about naming your podcast and you want more insights like this, I share ongoing reflections and strategy over on my YouTube channel. You can find me there talking about podcasting, content, and creative leadership. It is slowly growing. I love that it's growing. Thank you guys for those of you who are subscribing. I really appreciate it. And I will, of course, leave the link to my channel in the show notes. And if you want hands-on support, whether you're naming a podcast, you're launching one, or refining an existing one, I would love to help you. You can reach out for podcast coaching and support at soulpodcasting.com. That's SOUL podcasting.com. And thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next episode. Happy podcasting.